When you're looking at how to paint a camouflage pattern on a model, it can be really tricky. So on this channel already, we have looked at small infantry size models. We have looked at slightly larger sort of mech suit type models. But what if you go slightly bigger? So the Ghostkeel, for example, is literally the biggest stealth capable asset within the Tau arsenal. Now as a model, this is a beautiful model to build. But the thing is, with a big mech suit like this, yes, you've got a big canvas to play with, but also it's going to be a focal point within your army. So you want it to look really good as well. This is the Ghostkeel. I've also magnetised all of the weapons loadouts so I can swap them out for in-game purposes, but also those sub-assemblies make it a lot easier to paint. Everyone has their own process, but for me, if I'm not doing the base as a separate sub-assembly, I tend to build up the base first and get a base colour down because that tends to be the messiest phase and I don't want to mess up my paintwork later. But to keep it in line with the rest of the army, so I'm going to do a really simple desert theme base. Now I have done a separate video on this in more detail, which I'll put a link down in the description if you want. Super simple, and I can come back and play with it later, but that will do for now. Okay, so what scheme should we really paint this guy? So whilst he's a mech suit, is still essentially a vehicle. Now, larger vehicles in the real world, it can range from some really crazy ideas, like this dazzle paint that was painted on World War I ships. Looks crazy, but very, very effective. Arguably almost too effective for what we want to try and do today. So apart from that, camouflage schemes tend to be either one colour, which is just rather boring. Now I could go down the digital camo route, but on this particular model there's a lot of small surfaces and trying to do that would be an absolute nightmare. However, one of the reasons I love talking to you guys down in the comments is that he has some fantastic ideas. Now, one such conversation, we start talking about ATAX. It's a type of digital camouflage, but it basically looks a bit like smudged paint. I reckon I can do that. So when you're looking at a camouflage scheme to try and figure out how to paint it, you need to dissect it a little bit. So on this particular pattern, you kind of notice that the smudges move predominantly left to right, and I'm looking at the layers coming through. So the idea of this approach is to have certain panels in camouflage and other ones in a solid colour to help break up the camouflage to allow you to define the shapes and read the model correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that sand yellow from Vallejo and start to pick out the panels that I'm going to have in a camouflage scheme. And for this I'm going to use my trusty number 1 from series 33 from Rosemary & Co. The reason being is it has a nice sharp point to get in some of the details, but also it can hold a good amount of paint. Now on this initial blocking stage, I'm not being too careful because the paint is very thin, so I'll need to put 2 coats on anyway. Now that is ideal because it allows me to chop and change if I need to. So this is more of an initial sketch to see how it's going to look and if I've got the correct panels or if I need to have anything else to help define the shapes. So if it's a little bit messy and or get a little bit of paint overspill, I'm not that worried at this phase because I can tidy that up later. So that's the initial sketch done. Let's try blocking in some of the browns to once again see how that reads. The difference between these paints is that the model colour is a lot thicker and it covers a lot better in one coat than the Model Air. Obviously the Model Air is designed to go through airbrushes and it's designed to be a lot thinner, but it also has characteristics you can take advantage of to put multiple layers of colour through. With the model colour range, it's a lot more of a solid colour, but still not as thick as some other paints you might come across. But I'm still going to water it down a little bit. See, as I put it on, you can see straight away the difference in coverage between the 2 paints, which is really interesting. And remember, it's not that one paint is better than another paint. They just have different characteristics, and therefore they have different things you can take advantage of. For me, figuring out what those characteristics are, and then how I can use them in different scenarios is half the fun. But I am a bit weird like that. Okay, so that's the initial sketch done. So as you can see, I've done the chocolate brown, but also I've put a second layer of that Vallejo sand colour. And it's still a bit messy, but I can see how the blocks and the colours work. Also, at this stage, I can then put the weaponry back on again, through which I followed exactly the same process to see how the whole model looks as a whole. Now, as it goes, yeah, it needs tidying up, but I'm fairly happy with that. You could, if you wanted to, just skip the camouflage stage and just go straight to the final stages of finishing it off, and it will look good as it is. But not today. Within the lore of the Tau, they have a rank structure that I generally can't pronounce, so I'm not going to try. But the rank of the pilot of the Ghostkeel means that he has a red helmet. So first of all, I'm going to use a base coat of the Hull Red from Vallejo. So I've put 2 coats of Hull Red on, which is taking it from that black to a kind of a dark reddy brown. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to use the Fire Red from Vallejo Model Air, start from the front and then use quite short sketchy brush strokes which kind of feathers out that red as it goes backwards over the helmet. Right, so onto the camouflage phase. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this cam scheme essentially looks like smudged paint. When it comes to smudging paint, you can't beat oils and enamels because they dry so much slower than acrylics. Now for the brushes, I'm not going to use my best brushes for this. This job is ideal for an old, semi-destroyed brush, especially with all the bristles splayed out, because it'll help give a much more random pattern. Now for areas I need to smudge out, which I'll do later on, I'm going to use a filbert brush. Now these brushes are ideal for this because they have a curved surface, so you tend not to get that harsh, hard edge that you would do with a flat brush. So we've kind of got the sand bit down as a base already. So the first bit is going to be a black. Now I don't want to use pure black because that means that you have nowhere to go when it comes to your shadows. So I'm going to make an off black, so a very, very dark grey, by mixing some of that titanium white with the ivory black. Then using that really raggedy brush, I'm going to make small random marks across the entire model. In between these colours, I'm going to clean the brush out with enamel thinners. The next bit is a green. Now this is the enamel green from Humbrol. I wanted a slightly different shade of green in there as well. So what I've done is I've mixed some of that olive green from Windsor and Newton with the yellow ochre. The reason being is the olive green is a very, very dark green. So I've mixed that in with the yellow ochre to make it a bit lighter, a bit more yellowy. The next phase is that kind of beigey grey, and because that was looking a bit too bright, I've kind of taken it down a notch by adding in some dark grey as well. Now, to be honest with you, when it came back to reviewing the footage to edit this, I have no idea why I decided to put in yellow ochre, but we'll see how it works out. So one thing I've noticed is that the blocks of colour are still very blocky, which is not really how the ATAX pattern works. So I'm going to use the filbert brush with a little bit of enamel thinners on the tip, and that will reactivate the paint and allow me to kind of smudge it in and make it a bit more smudgy in places. So I've left that to dry overnight to give those oil paints enough time to kind of cure off. However, we're now firmly into that stage where a model looks absolutely rubbish, but we need to push through this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of the very matte effect of acrylic paint and use that to go over the top. So I'm going to use some German camouflage black brown from Vallejo model colour. Now this is quite a densely pigmented paint, but it's also very, very matte. I'm going to go over all of the camouflage panels with this. That'll take the gloss down, but also I can play it a bit smart as well and make that colour slightly darker and denser in the shadows, so I can start to enhance that volumetric lighting on the shapes themselves. Now lighting is a critical component when it comes to defining shape, and having really defined shapes is absolutely critical when you are doing a camouflage model like this, because it helps your eye to recognise what the shapes are, and therefore you can see the model and it doesn't just look like a camouflage blob. Now having let that dry, it is more of a satin finish rather than that oily glossy finish, and that's a lot better. Now the next stage in this process is an absolute critical one. It's using a very, very fine wash, as a pin wash essentially, just to drop in and re-establish the panel lines. Now you know you've got it the right consistency when you drop that paintbrush right onto the panel line and it sucks it using capillary action across the panel line. I don't know about you, but for some reason I find this bit particularly satisfying. Now by doing these panel lines, it is another way of really establishing the shapes. Once again, if you're breaking these shapes up, it makes them more visible. And hold on, before you click off, we're not finished yet. But first of all, I've got to say this model was a beautiful model to build. And this cam scheme, I think actually quite works on a model of this size. And what do you think? And have you used any other cam schemes for larger scale models like this? When it comes to painting bigger vehicles, that's a whole different story. If you like that, if you found that useful, please bash that like button and share it across your social media. And I'll see you for the next project.